Is the Lord in our midst or not? When I was a little boy, just a few years ago, growing up in a large American family of Italian descent, meant for us at least that leaving the crib did not necessarily guarantee that one would have a bed of his or her own, let alone a room. Does this start to sound familiar to anybody? And in our family, the way the grouping of ages worked was there was Ron, the eldest, 2 years later, Susan, 9 years later, Tony. Every Italian family has a Tony, right? 15 months later, Thomas. 3 minutes later, me. And then another 8 years, and Maria. That completes the Italian family, the Maria, right? So as it turns out, that middle grouping of Tony, Tom, and me, we shared a dormer room together upstairs. And instead of each having a bed, Mom and Dad took 2 twin beds, pushed them together, dressed them as one, and every third week, each of us took a turn sleeping on the crack of the bed. Now, when it was Tom's turn to sleep on the crack of the bed, Tony loved to torment him. He loved to instigate. This is what it would sound like. He'd say, in the hush and the quiet of the night, the darkness settling in, you'd hear him say, "You know, Tom, you know what lives under that crack you're sleeping on, don't you?" And he would describe, of course, the meanest, fiercest, ugliest monster, and Tom would become crying out, and Mom and Dad rushing up the stairs, and of course they'd turn on the lights and come in and listen to his sad story, and they'd pull the beds apart and show Tom that beneath the crack of the bed there were no mean, ugly monsters. Beds back together, redressed as one, lights out, Mom and Dad downstairs, the hush back in. Tony would say, "You know, Tom, parents can't see the trap door the monsters use." It would start all over again. Now this time, of course, Tom would explain about the trap door, and what Dad would do is rig up sort of a makeshift nightlight, and all would seem to settle in. Tony was so good to us. That was the night I remember that he taught us that if you looked very closely at the panes of glass in the windows on the dormer, you might notice that there were these shadows from a tree called the poplar tree, very common to the area where we grew up in Maryland, that looked amazingly like monster eyes waiting to get back in. Of course, somebody said, "Poor Tom." As we look back on our years in dealing with darkness as children, of course we know that the darkness can be unsettling to us. It seems to shake us sometimes to the core. What we cannot see, the things that we do not know, the fear of what is beyond our immediate senses. And yet, as we grow older, sometimes, just sometimes, we welcome in the solace of the quiet, the darkness. We hear even from the mystical tradition of our church, from saints such as Therese of Lisieux and John of the Cross, that the darkness of the soul, the dark night of the soul, the tragic time when it's difficult even to locate God within our perception of spirit, mind, and heart. And yet we know too that it's in the dark and difficult times of our lives that we are most ready to turn to God. It's when we experience tragedy and difficulty that we are most eager to seek out the God who, at other times in our lives, we just consider to be someone who is always there. And not that, of course, we welcome in difficulty. I once saw the Ziggy cartoon that I loved on a door in a rectory that said, in the first panel, "Wisdom. I love wisdom. It helps me avoid difficulties and mistakes in my life." And then in the second panel, Ziggy is scratching his head saying, "But I can't get wisdom until I've known difficulties and mistakes in my life. And folks, we realize, of course, that although we don't ask for those difficult moments, that somehow the difficulties of our lives stretch our hearts and enable us to love more deeply. Sometimes the tragedy of our lives help us to sense God's presence more powerfully. Sometimes it's when we really find that dark night of the soul and can't seem to put our hand on where in our lives this God might be, that we most potently and powerfully discover that he has never left us. He has always been with us, hidden or not, present to our hearts and lives. It was years after those nights in the dormer room that Tom and I were playing soccer during our high school formation with the conventual Franciscan friars. And as we were out back, we saw Father Alfred approaching with Tony at his side. And he said to us, arriving at the practice, he said, "Gentlemen, come with me." Now, I have to tell you, years later, I look at that moment and think of how kind and gracious it was for Father Alfred to call us gentlemen, because I have to tell you, in an all-boys Catholic high school, very often we were far from gentlemen, you see. So Father Alfred called us to travel with him. And it turned out that my grandfather Greco, this is on my mother's side, as he told us, had just had a serious stroke. We made our way to the hospital with Father Alfred, and when we arrived there, the thing that I remember first is the sea of people, the lights everywhere. In fact, I have to tell you, I come from a very, very large family, but it seems like they had multiplied overnight. And as I made my way in for all the cousins and the aunts and the uncles, there I saw my mom, sitting on the edge of grandfather's bed. And she held his hands. And just as I got to her side, through her tears, I heard her say, "Dad, Papa, what can I do for you?" It took him a long time to answer her. You see, the stroke was so serious that it had made it nearly impossible for him to move the muscles of his face and form the sounds from within his mouth. But when he was finally able to form the simplest of words, all he said to her was this: "Just be with me for a while." A few moments later, Father Alfred anointed grandfather with the sacrament. It was a powerful and beautiful experience for all of us there. And moments after that, grandfather died. I remember just about this time, my brother Ron, the eldest, arriving. And we had formed sort of a family circle around Mom in a section of the room. And surrounding her, embracing her, Ron, on arrival, looked at her and his heart leapt out to her. And he said, not having been present earlier for the exchange between Mom and her dad, he said to her so earnestly, "Mom, what can we do for you?" And she said, through her tears, "Just be with me for a while." Is the Lord in our midst or not? If we are to know the presence of God, my brothers and sisters in Christ, we must first place a value on that presence. We must recognize that in our lives there is nothing that has greater value for us than to give our God a true resting place to be present within our hearts and lives.